So the idea here is one of the reasons that um, the elites kind of kept a good measure of control in the Constitution of the Americas was a concern about mob rule. Of the popular rule was not necessarily wise rule, and the elites considered themselves more wise. But there's a dynamic tension between concentrated government that acts in the self-interest of the people and interests that are controlling it versus popular government on the one hand, popular will, and the fact of knowledgeable people being able to run things as opposed to, the crazy will, slamming back and forth between this and that and the other thing, and the immediate gratification, all that, the mob rule, mob thinking of supposedly the way ordinary people think. So there's this dynamic tension that's been going on in politics and governance for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And so with the wise democracy structure and idea, we're trying to get beyond that dynamic tension. We're trying to empower ordinary people to be able to influence what happens in governance, to either be their own governance, which happens at the personal and neighborhood and local levels most effectively. It's harder for direct popular governance of a whole country, particularly large ones, where they have to have somebody else in charge. So if somebody else is going to be in charge and running things day to day, you need to have some kind of oversight of them so that they don't go off the rails, become too centralized and oppressive, or acting in their own interests rather than the popular interest. So we want to build the competence of the people to be able to have wise oversight of governance. And that requires, at the very least, the governance be transparent. The people can watch what's going on in government operations so that they can oversee what's going on and redirect it as needed. But it also needs to be, we need to increase the capacity of we the people, of ordinary people and their various, civil society institutions to watch over what's going on in the government, and to imbue that whole system with more collective intelligence and wisdom, rather than the kind of collective stupidity, what's called incorrectly but popularly groupthink, and mob rule, and ignorance, people not knowing what's going on, not being aware of what's needed, and divided amongst themselves. The factionalism refers to we can't get it together. We're just fighting amongst each other and nothing effective is being done, which can happen in governance without any public oversight, but you start putting in the public and all of its separate factions, and it can get quite wild. So we're trying to say, what would be needed to actually engage the people in overseeing and directing their governance? And I use governance rather than government in most cases, because governance can include any function that shapes what people do. And government tends to be focused on institutions of governance, but people can govern themselves in many ways without these institutions. That's the distinction I make between the terms governance and government. But we want people being able to oversee government when it isn't them governing themselves. There are already in the US institutions called citizen review boards, where various people are appointed, people who have volunteered to do work overseeing various government functions, and they have various forms of power. It's a local level thing usually, and they're locally organized their own processes and all the rest. So that's one institution we already have. John Gastill, in his book By Popular Demand, talked about advisory panels where if there's a controversial local ordinance coming up to be decided, and either the city council, whatever it is, or a popular petition says, hold off on doing this, passing this law, until we have a one-day long citizen panel, listen to the people who are upset about it or pushing it, to find out how important it is. And if it is considered, if this little one-day panel that's picked at random decides that it's really important, then they will say this needs to be evaluated by an advisory panel, which was John Gastel's term for what I call citizen deliberative councils or citizen jury. It's a longer term, kind of week-long affair, looking at this thing that is being about to be decided and deciding whether it should be passed or not. And during that time, the city council has to hold off and not do any decisions on it. So that's, and then whatever the council decides doesn't dictate whatever the citizens decide, the citizen panel decides, doesn't dictate what's going to happen with it, but it is now public knowledge that this is what the people want. And if the council goes against that, that's much more, charged. The citizens might be more inclined to remove these people if they go ahead and pass something that people clearly don't want. But this isn't just a popular vote. This is an informed group of ordinary citizens who have made their judgment of what should be done with this legislation. So that's his advisory panels. And investigative journalism, and there's another thing where there's a saying in journalism of to disturb the what's the term? To disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed, kind of, that the people in power need to know they're being watched and need to be called on various things that they're doing that are not good or not popular. And investigative journalism does that. It'll dig into what's going on behind the scenes and try and find out. So that's another form of watching. And bloggers, a sort of mass, it's like investigative journalism of more mixed quality than among professional journalists, but there's lots of people who are watching over what's going on and commenting on it and getting threads of what needs to be known. So the existence of a whole blogosphere, as they call it, is another form of watching over. Citizen ballot initiatives, it's like here, the citizens who put together some new law that they want to see passed, and it has gotten enough support to get actually voted on. And this has been abused by special interests enough that there is now a thing called Citizen Initiative Review, which is a randomly selected panel who look at a ballot initiative and talk to people who are for it and against it in detail. And so they are watching over the people who are watching over, kind of. It's a double layer and more deliberative and more we the people kind of thing. Quality of life indicators is, this is the community has said, this is what's important to us, and this is what we think makes our lives good. And if these statistics are going down, then the government's not doing its job right. So this is a form of statistical feedback to support people in watching over how the government and other forces within the community are doing. Government transparency, being able to see, having the government make clear everything it's doing in all its parts is the idea of government transparency. So public availability of information, and the idea that every piece of legislation would ideally be online for citizens to comment on. There's a citizens group which has some software called Democracy OS in Argentina, where all the legislation that's going on in I think it's Buenos Aires city government, is being looked over by the, it's being published on people's cell phones, and they can look at it and discuss it and comment on it and organize around it. So that's a very tight loop for existing legislation, which is sort of a new electronic form of John Gassell's kind of thing. Of course, there's a question of who has cell phones and who doesn't, but that's all. The idea is good. The Freedom of Information Act in the United States, you have a Freedom of Information Act, which you can petition the government for certain information, and there's only certain kinds of information the government can withhold if they're being asked for it in the Freedom of Information Act. And very few citizens actually use Freedom of Information Act requests, but there's lots of civil society organizations that do it to get information of what's going on in the government on behalf of the general public. And they and other watchdog groups that are specifically organized to track what the government is doing and publicize it. And whistleblowers, people who are involved in government or involved in corporations, who then come out, they have inside knowledge, and they come out and say, hey, look, this is being done, this shouldn't be being done. It's like Edward Snowden from the NSA, and making public certain knowledge of what's happening inside the government. And they usually get in trouble. The government doesn't like that, obviously. So there are people who defend whistleblowers. There's a whole system of, extracting information from the government and trying to enable that system of extracting information from the government to continue to exist, be effective. And of course, there's the cell phones. Lots of citizens are taking videos on their cell phones of police behavior, of military behavior. I mean, they'll sort of track it, and a lot of stuff that's coming out now about how particularly Black people are being treated by police in the United States is known about now, and it's been going on for 100 years, but it's being more than 100 years. It's being viewed more clearly now because so many people have cell phones and know how to take videos of police behavior while they're doing just walking down the street, and they see something happen and they start to video it, and then that video goes viral, and suddenly the public is all talking about it. So these are all forms of both established forms of transparency and transparency which is enforced on the government, and having the deliberative activities like the citizen initiative review and the John Gassell's advisory panels adds a level of collective intelligence and wisdom into this, that there's still a lot of the examples I've given are more, here's how to access what's going on with the government, more than supporting the wisdom. So the more of the kind of citizen deliberative activities that I talk about in other patterns is where more of the wisdom comes, but it's definitely part of this pattern. You don't just want the government to be totally open with everybody handling what they find out in crazy ways. That doesn't really move us ahead towards a wise society.